In this session, we're going to continue looking at our youngest communicators. We're going to begin to assess their current method of communicating, how they communicate, and for what purposes that they're already interacting with you. From there, we'll be looking at the communication matrix so that we can document those skills, and finally, considering how we might write goals to enhance and improve our students' communication skills. By the end of this session, you'll be able to access the Communication Matrix online by setting up an account and answering questions to document your students' communication skills. You'll be able to identify the different ways they communicate, the purposes they communicate for, and to use this information to create goals to improve your child's functional communication skills. This is the home page for the Communication Matrix. So the first thing you're going to do is go to this tab right here at the top, and you're going to click here and you're going to register for an account. But for today's purposes, I want to give you a chance just to look at it. So we're just going to go down, scroll down a little bit here, and we're going to select Try It so that you can see the different questions in the format. We're going to skip the registration for today. And just jump right into the questions. So the way that we typically do this is we will meet with either the family or the teachers or both at the same time and go through a series of questions to determine how the child is currently communicating. So first we're going to say that we are going to refer to this child as an individual, and we're going to click Next. And then it's going to start asking you questions. This individual doesn't seem to have real control over their body yet. The only way I know that he wants something is because he fusses or whines when he's unhappy or uncomfortable, and he smiles or makes noises or calms down when he's happy and comfortable. Does this statement describe the individual? So for this example, I'm going to say, no, it doesn't, because they actually are doing a little bit more than this when they're communicating. They're doing more than just fussing or whining or calming down. So I'm going to say no, and I'm going to select Next. The next question is asking if the child controls their own behaviors, but they're not using them for communication purposes. I'm going to say no, they're actually attempting to communicate with me, and I'm going to click Next. Now I'm going to look at statement C. He's clearly trying to communicate with me. He knows how to get me to do something for him, and he uses some of these kinds of behaviors like gestures or making sounds, pointing. Maybe he's using some speech or some picture symbols. So I'm going to say yes. This statement describes the individual. Now, if you don't get to this point, this statement C, and say yes to it, you're not going to get a whole lot of information out of the communication matrix. So for those students who are truly at a pre-intentional, pre-symbolic stage, it's not going to help them very much. All right, now we're going to click on Next, and it's going to get into the actual questions. So every question works in this format. They're going to give you a description of the child's communication. They're going to show you a picture. They're going to show you a video and ask you to answer yes or no if the child is able to do that type of communication. And then after this, they're going to give us an opportunity to describe the communication. So this one says, does this individual intentionally show you that he or she doesn't want a certain thing or a certain activity? So I'm going to say for my little fella, yes, he definitely does this. All right, once you select yes and you've said the child has this function of communication, we're going to now go down and describe how he refuses or rejects. So the first level is going to ask me, does he refuse or reject using body movements like his whole body, twisting or turning away, and whether that is not used, emerging, or mastered. I'm going to say that this child is mastered. His head movements, does he turn his head away or to the side? I'm going to say he's mastered that. He uses arm and hand movements. He pushes. Leg movements he's not really using. Does he use early sounds, so screaming or whining? He definitely has that mastered. Frowning and grimacing, yes. Pushes away the object or person, yes. It gives you an opportunity to comment in this little box down here. Then we get a little bit more advanced, so you're going to see that we become more and more symbolic as we go down the page. The next one is looking at how we use conventional gestures or vocalizations. So does he give the unwanted item to me? I'm going to say that's emerging. Does he shake his head? No, he's not doing that. Does he use specific vocalizations? And I'm going to say no for that. If I go down further, it's going to ask me about concrete symbols. So does he reject a photo or a drawing of something? So if I show him a photograph of a cookie, does he push it back or throw it down? He's not doing anything, my little friend, with concrete symbols, so I'm going to say these are not used. I can look at abstract symbols, so now we're getting more and more symbolic. Spoken words, so he's not really saying no. Does he use a sign for no or stop? Does he read a written word? Can he write a word or point to a word that says no or finished? Is he using Braille or 3D symbols? Is he using a picture symbol that means no or stop? And finally, the last skill level, is language. And basically, this just means combining two or more symbols, saying stop it, all done, no want. And then that's going to be our highest level. Once we've answered all of these, we click next. And it goes on to the next question. So you're going to go through all of the different functions of communication, those that the students could possibly use, and you're going to answer these questions. And at the end, we'll get to see a grid that will give us a summary. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. So we're going to take about 3 minutes to look at the home page and the sequence of questions for the communication matrix. Now you'll see that for this video, instead of signing in or registering, I just selected try it. You can do this for the first time if you would like to, and then it will offer you the opportunity to register after the fact. If you'd like to go ahead and get registered, it's completely free for the first administration, so there's no risk at all. As you go through, you're going to see that it asks you a series of questions to determine the purposes that the child is communicating. So you're going to answer those questions either yes or no, and then it's going to go through another series of choices for you to talk about how the child is communicating for that purpose. So are they using their bodies for gestures? Are they making sounds? Are they crying? Are they using intentional communication by pointing or reaching? Are they using speech or sign language? As you go through, you'll check whether these skills are not observed, or if they are emerging, or if they're mastered. At the end of that, you're going to come up with a grid that we'll take a look at the very end of this session. So this is a little handout called Communication Modes. What we're going to do with this is allow you to start thinking about your individual students and considering whether they're using pre-intentional behaviors, intentional behaviors, or are they using unconventional or conventional communication attempts? Do they understand symbols like concrete or abstract forms of communication? And finally, are they putting words and symbols together to form language? As we're looking through the next slides, I want you to begin thinking about one of your students and start to document the ways that they're currently communicating on this worksheet. So when people begin to communicate, at first they can be pre-intentional, meaning they may be showing you that they're feeling something or wanting or needing something, but they don't necessarily mean to communicate to you. You understand that when the child cries or laughs or smiles or moves their body in a certain way, that they want something, that maybe they're hungry, or maybe they're tired, or maybe they saw something that made them feel happy. This stage of communication requires for the partners to interpret what the child needs. We are guessing based on our knowledge of the child and how they typically respond to certain events around them or certain people, and guessing what it is that they're trying to say to us. At our next level of skill, the child is beginning to control their own behaviors, but they're not communicating intentionally through those behaviors. The partners are still having to interpret what the child needs or wants or is feeling based on their body movements, their early sounds, their facial expressions, or simple gestures. pretty soon, children learn that the way they move their body, the sounds they make, their facial expressions and gestures can control the people and the situations around them. They may frown or grab a toy that they want and yell in order to get mom to hand over their favorite stuffed animal. They may stomp their feet to express displeasure. These are unconventional behaviors that are used intentionally. These communication behaviors are not symbolic because they do not involve any sort of symbol, and they're unconventional because they're not socially acceptable or recognizable for us to use as we grow older. As a rule of thumb, when I'm trying to determine if a behavior is unconventional communication, I consider whether a stranger would understand what the child was communicating in that moment. At our next level of communication, the child has figured out that pointing or nodding or shaking their head, waving or hugging are all behaviors that anyone around them can recognize. These are conventional behaviors because other people, even strangers, know what the child means when he waves at them. They understand what it means when he points at a toy that he wants, or when he nods his head when mom offers a cookie. Conventional communication is at a more advanced level because anyone can understand it. It is very clear and relatively specific. Some children go through a stage of using concrete symbols. These are going to be symbols that physically resemble what they represent and are used communicatively. Concrete symbols might look like, feel like, move like, or sound like what they represent. These can be things like photographs or objects or pieces of an object that they're representing. It can be iconic gestures that everyone understands, like saying woo woo to mean a train. Most individuals skip this stage and go directly to the next level, but for some individuals, concrete symbols may be the only type of symbol that makes sense to them. For others, concrete symbols may serve as a bridge to using more abstract symbols. Typically, developing children use concrete symbols in conjunction with gestures and words, typically. We're finally at a level of being able to use abstract symbols. Now, abstract symbols are really important because this is the first time that we can communicate about something or an action or a situation that is occurring but not immediately observable. For example, I can say the word horse, or I can sign it, or I can show a picture symbol, and you understand, even though we're not on the farm and there's not a horse in the field next to us, that I'm talking about that brown creature with the 4 legs and the hooves that people sometimes ride on. So abstract symbols can be things like speech. Words that we say are considered abstract symbols. It could be a manual signs, like the gentleman here and his son. It could be brailled words or printed words. Text is considered an abstract symbol, and it might be those picture communication symbols that we're used to using in our classrooms. We're finally at a level of using abstract symbols. Now, abstract symbols are really important because at this level, it's the first time that you can say something or communicate about an activity or an event or an item that is not physically present outside of that context. For example, I can say the word horse, or I can sign it like this dad and his son are doing. I could use brailled words or even printed text, HORSE, or I might use a picture symbol like our board maker symbols that we often find in our classrooms. To say the word horse, you know that I'm talking about that farm animal that has 4 legs and a hoof and sometimes runs in races and people can ride on, without actually being in that environment on the farm standing beside the horse's pen. The next form of communication is the use of abstract symbols. Now, this is a very important step in communication development. When we use abstract symbols, now we're able to talk about events or items that are not immediately observable, that are not in the immediate context with understanding. For example, I can say the word horse, or I can point to the word HORSE, or I can sign the word horse, and you understand that I am talking about that animal that has 4 legs and hooves, and sometimes people ride, that lives on a farm, without actually being on the farm with me pointing at a particular animal. So this is a really important stage. Now these symbols are abstract because they are not physically similar to what they represent. We've all simply agreed that HORSE means that animal, but the look of the word or the look of the picture doesn't necessarily always match what it represents. These are used one at a time initially to communicate. Our final form of communication is language. That simply means that symbols, either concrete or abstract, are combined into 2 or 3 symbol combinations according to grammatical rules. So the child understands that the meaning of the symbol combinations may differ depending on how the symbols are ordered. The communication matrix asks us to look at the functions of our students' communication. Unlike the previous section where we were considering how the child communicated, now we're considering why they communicate. In the communication matrix, we're considering how they communicate when they're refusing or rejecting something, how they're asking for something, obtaining an item or an action from you, how they engage for social interaction purposes, and how they share and receive information. The first function that we're going to consider is communicating for the purpose of refusing something. I'm sure we've all had a lot of experience with our children communicating to reject. This can be rejecting an object that you offer them, rejecting an activity, turning down something that you suggest that they do, or getting out of a situation. Now, sometimes our students do this in ways that are not effective. We're not going to say that these behaviors are bad, but they just don't work for the student to engage with someone and to maintain their relationship. Children learn at a very early age to communicate for the purpose of obtaining something. So this is going to be things like asking for more of an object that they like. Maybe I want more of those Cheetos. Requesting more of an action, such as pick me up. Requesting a new object, so something that they can't see but they know exists. Like, I want that toy that's hidden in my closet. Maybe they're requesting a new action, so something that hasn't been happening before. They may communicate to request an object that's absent or to just make a choice. Now, this can happen in a lot of different ways, like we talked about the forms of communication. They may be doing this with facial expression or gestures. They may be doing it verbally or vocally. The next purpose of communication is not always the first one that we consider when we're writing IFSPs and IEPs, and that's communicating for social interaction. So our students begin communicating for this purpose just as early as they do for communicating to refuse or obtain. They ask for attention, they show affection, they greet people, they might offer or share a snack or a toy with a friend or with you. They communicate so that they can direct your attention to something that they like or are interested in or are shocked by. And they communicate for polite or social interaction. So even our very little friends do this type of communication. They might do it through facial expression or through gestures or through sounds or verbally as they begin to speak or use symbols. The last function we're going to consider is communicating to gain and share information. Now, when we're in a school environment, a lot of times we think that this means academic vocabulary. So naming shapes and letters and building basic vocabulary. It does include things like that, but it also includes being able to answer yes and no questions, to ask questions. Where are we going? What are we doing? Where's mommy? When are you coming back? To name things and people, and to make comments. I like it. I don't like it. That stinks. That's really fun. The final piece of the communication matrix is to pull it all together. So after you've answered all of those questions, you now have a good idea of why your student communicates, how they communicate for those purposes, and how consistent. Are they not using it? Is it emerging? Or is it a skill that they've mastered? So what does this do for us? Well, When you finish the communication matrix, we're going to know how the student is currently communicating for a variety of functions. It helps us to see what functions of communication they might be missing. Sometimes our little friends are very good at communicating to ask for something or reject something, but aren't yet sharing information or socially engaging. That's important for us to know. It helps us figure out what the next step in symbolic communication may be. So maybe our child is communicating beautifully through gestures, but isn't really using any kind of symbolic communication. That's very limiting. It means that only people that know the child are going to understand what they're trying to say. It lets us know what functions of communication are present, but might need a little bit more instruction or augmentation or AAC in order to be more effective. So maybe we have our student who's using behaviors to communicate to reject, and that may work, but it breaks down social relationships. So we probably are going to look for more efficient and effective ways to do that, most likely in a symbolic manner like a symbol or a sign or a gesture that other people recognize, and it maintains our relationships. Finally, the communication matrix lets us select appropriate goals considering all of those features that we just discussed. So now let's pull it all together and talk about IFSP goal development. What goals are we going to target? What's reasonable for us to target? How are we going to make those decisions? When I'm writing goals, I like to consider the function, the purpose of communication before I consider the form of communication. And I want to make sure that these goals address real communication needs in real environments for real purposes. So thinking about these three features of a goal, we're considering the function. So what purpose do they need to communicate for? So are they obtaining something, rejecting something? Remember how we talked about that on the communication matrix. These are all of the functions that are along the bottom edge of that chart we created. Next, we're going to look at their mode of communicating, and we're going to consider what's the next most advanced way they communicate. So if they're currently communicating through gestures, physical gestures, facial expression, could we add a symbol or a sign or a word to make this communication something that more people will recognize, so it'll be more efficient for them? And finally, we look at the context. So where and in what activity or situation with whom are they needing to communicate this? So there has to be a purpose for communication. A lot of times we'll see people working on vocabulary, naming items, or finding an item on their communication device. Doing that kind of activity might be helpful to practice, but it doesn't really give you a purpose. You're not really communicating to do anything. And that's actually the hallmark of communication. Communication is functional for a purpose. And when it's taught out of context, it becomes harder for students to learn. So we want to consider implementing our instruction in the real world for our little kids. So going back to our communication matrix, you can see that the mode of communication is this first column. The function of the communication is this bottom row. And then the context for this particular child is in the family kitchen when they're cooking dinner. So this may have been a time that the family identified is difficult for the student. Maybe the child has trouble being patient and waiting and allowing mom and dad to focus on fixing dinner. So maybe we want to give them a way to participate in that. This might be an opportunity for them to make some choices about what they're going to have for dinner or how they want to participate with the family. Now on this particular matrix, you can see that currently they're communicating in a conventional gestural manner, but they're not really using any kind of symbolic communication to make a choice. So we may do some things like give them some photos to choose from or some picture symbols where they could request the items that they want or the activity that they might want to communicate. So in this example, the function would be that Ethan will request a favorite snack item. The mode, or how, the form, how he's communicating, is going to be by touching a photo of the snack item given 2 choices. And the context of this is in the kitchen after nap time. So what do we do next? Well, once we understand how and why our child is communicating, then we're going to consider other things about the child, the environment that they're in, the tasks that they need to complete, and what tools we need to pull out to make available for that child. We typically do this using a SET framework, which you can learn about in one of our other videos. The tools that I might consider for our little buddy Ethan are some photos of the family, some simple signs and gestures, some choice boards, maybe an iPad with an AAC application. We might want to think about whether we need to make adaptations for this little fellow for his visual access, either photos or maybe some high contrast, because we can see in the first column of our SET framework that he's a child who has strabismus and CVI. Thanks for taking a look with us at how the communication matrix can inform your goal decision based on how your child is communicating and for what purposes they're communicating. We hope this helped you and would recommend your next stop be to look at